guys, how are you? This is Rico Cortes from Witcast. This is a regular podcast in which we bring different types of people to talk about different types of topics. And today we have a very important friend of mine in which she's taught me everything I know.
That's right.
Dinah Dye. We want to talk about her book, and I want to add her here to the podcast that we want to talk about. Okay, Dinah, it's always nice to see you. I've been reading part of your book. You just I got all your books, the whole collection. I got them.
And now you're really smart.
No, I'm really smart, and I want to read the one that you just released, which is called what?
The Temple Revealed in Noah's Ark, from Chaos to Order.
Okay, one of the things for the audience who don't know you, Dinah, give us a little background, please.
Okay. So I will spare you the whole story, but I grew up in Ottawa, Canada, a conservative Jewish home. And when I was quite young, my parents moved into a Gentile neighborhood. So I was exposed to some things that I didn't know about previously. I did go to Hebrew school, Orthodox Jewish summer camp, and we celebrated the festivals as a family. We went to the synagogue regularly. So there was, two things going on in my life. Later on, I got involved in the New Age movement pretty deeply, studied a lot. I'm a researcher at heart, so I studied the whole New Age world. And that was all kind of through high school and into my early 20s. About the time I was about 25, 26, I put a backpack on my back and spent about 4 or 5 years in Europe and traveling all around the world by myself. I did spend about 6 months in Israel in 1974, which was, right after the Yom Kippur War. So that was pretty significant. And so it was around 1979 is when I finally met Yeshua, the Messiah. It's a long story. If you go to my website, there is my testimony there. But once there, it was hard to find and connect with a lot of Jews, although there was a period in which there was sort of a revival amongst the Jews that I knew. So I, was exposed to Jews for Jesus, and so the Chertoff family out of Pennsylvania and things like that. But I recognized that the need to connect the Gospels and the epistles to the Torah, that was right out of the gate. I saw that. Now, I didn't really know much about the New Testament. I had never read it. So when I read it fresh, I realized how many things the Torah was speaking of, how many idioms and how many different connections there were to the festivals and stuff. It was so clear to me, having grown up in it. So that was, I launched my world. And now it's 42 years. I've been doing this, connecting the two. I've been writing books and traveling, teaching. The ministry is called Foundations in Torah. And I don't know, that's
so you're basically focusing on educational platform, writing books. How many books you have at this point?
Well, I have 3 books in the series: Temple Revealed in Creation, The Temple Revealed in the Garden, The Temple Revealed in Noah's Ark. But I also have some other books. I have one it's a workbook series called Study to Show Yourself Approved. I also have a workbook called Bonhoeffer from I don't even remember the title, From Tyranny to Freedom. And the book goes along with the DVD series. So basically those 5.
Great. Well, I appreciate you hanging out with me. I always enjoy your books, and I've read them, except for this one. I'm getting ready to sit down and read it. I was teaching this week's Torah portion, which happens to be Noach. And,
imagine.
Right? And what I did on Wednesday in Spanish, so I'm going to be teaching it tomorrow again to the English audience, but in Spanish, I was showing them some things that we've discussed for years in regards to creation, how the story of Noah is all about a new creation motif.
Absolutely.
I want to talk a little bit more about that, but before we get into that, I want to remind the audience that the way you and I study, and you can chime in anytime you like, the way you and I study, and this is something that I started doing about 11 years ago, when I began to study ancient Near Eastern research, which for your PhD, I think you study that, right? You have a doctorate, don't you?
So, it's a D-Min, not a PhD. So it's a doctor of ministry. And yes, I did spend some time studying the ancient world, Babylon, Assyria, and all that ancient Near East culture.
And by the way, that changes your whole understanding of the Bible.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
John Walton made a statement. I'm reviewing the genre teaching that he has on Genesis, the whole Logos course that he has. And he made the statement that I've missed before. He said, when we study the Bible from the West, we are looking from the outside in, but the people in the Bible, writing the Bible, they understood the environment, the culture, the background, and the idioms. So they understood. So the writer didn't have to over explain certain principles and motifs. They all understood it. So
exactly.
you and I, what we try to do is try to allow people to study the Bible by sharing them from the inside out, so that we can get a greater understanding. And so understanding culture, the narrative, the metaphors. Just because we believe in certain metaphors does not mean that we're not disregarding that we are disregarding the Bible.
Right.
But you and I know that the scripture was written in certain language that is foreign to us today, and this Psalm 93 is one of them.
Yeah.
So let me read it, and then you can just go on and expound on it. It's actually in the prologue of your book, and as I'm rereading it, a scary part of it is I understand exactly what it's trying to say, and that's kind of weird, because I remember years back I would read this type of stuff and I'm going like, whoop, it went over my head. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your throne is established of old. You are from everlasting. The floods have lifted up, O Adonai, the flood have lifted up their voice. The floods lifted up their waves. The Lord on high is mightier than the sound of many waters. Yeah. Than the mighty waves of the sea. That is Psalms 93, verse 2-5. Now, let me ask you a question. How many hours can you teach on those few verses?
Well, my whole book, which is why it's the very first, it's the very first scripture, because it lays the foundation. And let me just mention for people, because the stories are all literal historical. We've got real people living in real places doing real things. But the writers are focusing our attention on something specific. And as you said earlier, they don't see the need to add in every little piece of information. And so the historical backdrop isn't necessarily what they're focused on, but we recognize it's there. But they want us to see something else. So these other aspects of it kind of should jump out off the page to us. This is what they're trying to communicate. So we have a lot of flood language, raging rivers, water language in the scriptures. Events, and because what's that?
Events too. We have all these events that happen with water, and many people don't even know that that's a resurrection, new creation motif.
Yeah, absolutely. So right out of the gate in Genesis chapter 1, we see the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. And so that replays itself over and over again. Now, waters and raging rivers and floods came to mean for the ancient world armies and nations, and really everything outside the sacred space and the boundary that God established for his people. And so you see him here. So the basic principle of creation is the establishment of a cosmic house, which encapsulates heaven, earth, and sea. And so often when you're seeing, when God is talked about as the God of heaven, and his king, his Messiah, is the ruler over the earth. But then we have this area outside the boundary called the seas and the waters. But yet God, our God, rules over all three domains, all three spheres. So he has sovereignty and rulership over the seas, over the nations, over that dominion. And so you see this right out of the gate in Psalm 93. His dominion is over the seas. And so that pattern continues. I mean, we've got multiple examples. I don't know if you want to talk about any of the ones in particular, but that's the backdrop. So the seas become the place of the deep representing the throne of the enemies of God, the rulers and kings of this world. So there's just a lot of language related to that.
So I was also doing a research on, Exodus 14, when the Lord took Israel to the Red Sea, and they were right near Saphon. And I began to look into the ancient Ugaritic type of creation motif, and also the battle against Yam, sea.
Yes.
And that is so prevalent to understand why God chose to take them to that location and show his sovereignty over creation. I really like the way you open the book. I like that, I'm reading it. And I love the way you're trying to establish a visual.
Yes.
And I like that, because sometimes when we read the Bible, now when I read it, to me, it's all visual.
Right.
But when people read it without the proper background, it's just letters, and you think that just by going to the Hebrew language alone that you can finally get the full context. And I highly recommend that. It's not necessarily true. You get an insight on it, but you're not really understanding the whole backdrop. I love the way you open. You said Elohim spread his celestial robe over the cosmos to fashion a heavenly tent. I love that. And it says the master architect remeasured the heavens, recalculated the firmament, and counted out additional galaxies. He stretches measuring rod over the entire earth to verify its dimensions. And he reset the boundary lines of his sacred space. That is so significant language that once I understood it, when I read about the feast, when I read about eating kosher, when I read about eating clean, when I read about keeping the mitzvot and doing what God asked us, man, God is allowing us to enter his sacred space. And then you continue and you say, after reinstalling bars and gates, and that separated the waters, you mean the seven pillars, right?
Mm-hmm.
And says, above from those below, Elohim once again declare his sovereignty over the cosmos. The world was now firmly reestablished. His kingdom reigned over all, surrounding his throne of glory. Heaven's host of piercing stone proclaim, yours is the kingdom and power and the glory forever, from everlasting to everlasting. You are God. And that is such a powerful introduction, because you just basically outline what new creation motif is.
And well, so let me just say, so the reason I added in recalculated, remeasured, etc., the statement I'm making is, yes, Genesis 1, he brought forth the perfect creation, a place for his presence. And then, of course, Adam and Eve violated the sacred space.
Right.
But now with the Noah story, he is the emphasis here is that the Noah story is a story of recreation. Smack dab out of Genesis 1, it's repeating itself. So that's why I emphasized this is the story of recreation in Noah.
The parallels between chapter 8 and 9 of Genesis and 1 and 2 are
yeah.
They're like almost exactly parallel to. I was sharing it in Spanish and people were blown away, and I told them even the resurrection of Yeshua was found within the message of when the ark rested on Mount Ararat. And it's incredible, because as we go, I have a feeling that going through your book is only going to allow me to get a greater insight into some of the other metaphors that you use. You just mentioned one about the sea representing also the enemies and the kingdoms.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit.
So the deep. So we see right out of the gate, Genesis 1, the concept of God creating out of tohu vavohu that which was empty and formless, and scholars argue over whether, is it disorder, chaos, whatever, but we have a sense of the destructive elements coming first, and then over the deep, the tehom, and every time we don't see that word used very often, and it's but it's certainly mentioned in the Song of Moses when they're crossing the sea. So the idea of the seas was associated with the monsters, the sea monster we have on the fifth day, and this idea of a throne or the center of power for the nations was in the deep. And that's why when we see them crossing the sea and then the waters come back, that Pharaoh is returning to his place, his sphere, his domain, the deep.
That's cool.
So, yeah.
I never saw it like that.
Yeah. And of course, all his army. And so they're just going back into the nations. I mean, you think that maybe there was a possibility for Pharaoh to join Israel, but chose instead to destroy Israel. So we have this destructive element that starts out. The same thing happens in the story of Noah. And there's a lot of scholars that have done the sort of chiastic structure of Noah, and there's a myriad of examples. But the first how the chiasm works, So the first section of the chiasm is dealing with the same thing that we have in the early verses of Genesis, the destructive element. And then it switches because the center of the chiasm is God remembered Noah. And then it switches to the recreation, new creation model that parallels Genesis chapter 1. So that's the emphasis. It's interesting that God remembered Noah would be the center of the chiasm. And I would suggest, because in the ancient world, it's not about remembering and forgetting. Oh, I forgot to buy bread. It's about bringing something into existence so that it can realize its creative element versus that which is destructive. So when you die, you're considered to be forgotten. You know, you go into the ground, nobody remembers who you are. But the idea of remembered means to bring something to life. So the fact that God remembered Noah, so the thing switches at that point, and now we see life coming forth again. Exact same pattern. And it's really the exact same pattern that we have when the children of Israel are in Egypt and they cross through the sea. It's the same pattern that we have when Joshua and they were all at the edge of the Jordan and they were going to cross over, and the waters dried up and they're going to cross over carrying the tabernacle to Gilgal at that point. So it's going to find its fulfillment in Yeshua because we have multiple examples of him having rulership over the sea, over the waters. You know, we can read those stories and Yeshua walked across the waters, and, you know, however that looked, I don't know, I wasn't there. But a greater message is of his sovereignty over the nations.
Right.
Okay, that's what he came. That was his purpose.
Hebrews chapter 10 tells you that
Yes.
he officiated and sitting at the right hand of the Father until he made all the enemies under his feet.
Yep. Yeah.
So that supports exactly. First Corinthians 15 says the same thing too. So let me ask you a question in regards to remembering.
Okay.
Because as you were saying, and I'm looking in the Bible here, in the story of Exodus, because if we're connecting the redemption story as a new creation or recreation, story of Noah, and then God remembered. So the same thing can be said in the story of redemption in Egypt. It's the same blueprint.
It's the same thing. Yeah.
Same thing.
He's bringing forth creation life. When anytime you see remembered, it's bringing that creative life into existence.
So with that being said, then when we follow the Bible, it's a continual recreation. God is constantly trying to recreate his creation and bring order to the cosmos, and we keep messing it up. Yeah,
we're the ones that keep doing that, don't we? So you know, the creation story for Israel, as I mentioned earlier, I think we were off air, but the ancients, all of their creation stories had to do with the creation of the state as a political entity, versus God's creation story is about the creation of the kingdom of heaven over heaven, earth, and sea. And so everything is taking us to that point where he is going to take down what the nations created, the gods of their world, the rulers of their world, the empires of their world, and all the stuff that goes with it. And he's telling Israel a different story because they're supposed to act differently. I mean, God's goal is to subdue the nations, but to bring the nations into the kingdom, their choice. Correct. But we have a distinct between the kingdom of heaven and the nations, a boundary, just like we have for the temple, God's sacred boundary. And
so the temple really is it's a physical manifestation of a microcosm of what he wants the earth to be. His space, and that's why death cannot dwell in there.
Exactly.
That reminds me of Isaiah 43, where it says, "But now thus says the Lord, who created you, O Jacob, he who formed you, O Israel. Fear not, I have redeemed you. I have called you by your name. You are mine." And you know that's an adoption language. It says, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you." And then he goes into, "I am the Lord your God, the God of Israel, the Holy One of Israel, who's your Savior." That's quite interesting because now when we read this text, that's resurrection text.
New life, new creation. And Isaiah, of all of the prophets, is just filled with new creation language. And it's deliverance from enemies. Obviously, the ultimate enemy is death. But we
Exactly.
see in the story of Isaiah the defeat of the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians. Everything's in that in the prophet Isaiah in his book. And so we kind of remove that element and forget about it. But again, it's this that God's desire is for the nations to bow their knee to him, and what he's always doing is deconstructing the gods of the nations, because those gods aren't going to do anything for you.
Correct.
And that's what we're dealing with today. Look at the gods of the nations that they want us to worship.
Yeah.
And so it's the gods of the nations, it equals death.
Right.
That does not bring life. And so everything about God's creation story is to bring life. And that's how you determine his
That's
kingdom.
true. It's not surprising then why Isaiah is one of the most quoted books by the Apostle Paul, and also in the Gospels, because they understood the premise of God is getting ready to do a new creation.
Yes.
Okay, so I made a connection. I want to get your opinion on this one, because we're talking about Noach and recreation.
Mhm.
So I'm reading through the story of Noach. I noticed that when Yeshua says, "As in the days of Noah shall be," so so that means that everyone in the first century, not everyone, but the majority of the people, they understood the new creation motif. At least the people were in tune with the prophet Isaiah.
Right.
But then when I began to teach this past Wednesday, I noticed that the very thing that brought chaos to the world in the garden, and also in the story of Noah, has been repeated all throughout, that we are exactly in the same place today. Let me give you a few examples, and you can expound from that if you wish. Right now, we know that they began to call upon the name of the Lord. I don't know how you feel about that expression in the book of Genesis. Different scholars have different ideas, but we know that there was chaos and violence, and we do not know to what extent it was going on in the book of Genesis chapter 6. It gives us an inkling about the daughters of men and the sons of God, and we're not going to get into that topic, because you know how it is with
my book.
It's in your book. So
I broke it all down. So if anyone wants to know, we're not going to tell them here. You got to go read the book.
Perfect. You got to go. Oh, okay, perfect. So what I think was really interesting is, if people are fighting with one another, and I'm noticing the world is rejecting God's creation.
Mhm.
They are murdering the babies in the womb.
Right.
They are rejecting God's identity by not calling themselves male or female.
Right.
They want to go to Mars and create a new civilization, rejecting God's gift and his sacred space, which we have defiled.
Right.
So we are pretty close if we go into what people say eschatology or prophetically. I mean, we are really in a really interesting period. And it's by no coincidence, Dina, that they want a one world order. They want to reset.
Yes. That goes back to, we could go back to the Sumerian king list. So one of the things I do in the book is trace the rise of tyranny. Like, what did that look like? So anciently, before the flood, we have all these kings of the Sumerians who lived like these fantastically long amounts of time, 28,000 years. Meredith Kline calls this the rise of divine kingship. Yeah. And then, so after the flood, and of course, we don't technically know the date or whatever, but after the flood, we see the kingship, the divine kingship returns. Are you there?
I'm here. Just keep going. I'm just sending a quick message. Hold on.
Okay, going. I'll keep talking. So what happens is, obviously the number one issue we see these nomadic communities start to collect into small villages and towns. And over time, the small villages and towns turn into what we call city-states that have a king ruling over the city-state. But the number one issue, of course, is food. So once they reach a city-state status, they have figured out how to grow food on a mass scale, in particular wheat, and they figured out how to store large amounts of wheat to feed the people. So now we have this divide between urbanization and sort of the agricultural world. I mean, isn't that interesting? We're dealing with the exact same thing.
Same thing.
So what I tell people and what I say in the book is, these kings recognize that they need to exercise control over the food supply and over energy. And that's how they win. So what happens is the first world emperor, the first ruler of world empire is Sargon I of Akkad. And he basically pulls together all these city-states and rules over them from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. And he is really our first world ruler, our first world beast, if you will. And our first, if we think Nimrod as a title, which I do, he was probably the first. So out of that ends up coming, the Babylonian, the Assyrian, the Neo-Assyrian, the Neo-Babylonian, Persian, on and on and on. So the consistent theme in the Bible is world empire. And we see Israel under the dominion of world empire, practically the entire Bible, except for about 500 years when they had their own monarchy. We had Saul and David and Solomon, but even under their own monarchy, they had like totally rotten kings who ruled over them and lorded over them, and excessive taxation, and life was miserable. So there really wasn't a large amount of.
You mean a Biden?
Yeah. There wasn't a large amount of time in which Israel really experienced the perfect, well, there was never a time where it was perfect, where rulers were, they didn't lord it over the people and make their lives miserable. There just wasn't that much time in their whole history where they got to experience that. So that's the backdrop of the Bible, world empire versus Israel.
That's simple, right?
Yeah.
So in the last program we did together, we brought up a good point about the Bible being a political book instead of solely theology. Personally, I don't think the Torah is a theological book. To me, is a legal binding document that contains historical accounts, legal accounts, civil accounts, and theology in it. But it's mainly the structure of who the creator is. He brings dominance over creation, and he puts Israel in a place of dominance to reveal who he is. And it's interesting that Yeshua is trying to restore that. That's exactly what everything he did. I noticed when I began to really meditate on the new creation motif, chaos to order. All right. I don't know if you see my methodology. I haven't shown it to you.
Yeah, I saw the chart. It's good.
Yeah, and you really helped me a lot with that, because when I began to connect all the different spheres of focus study that I was doing, then I try to connect them all. And it was actually your recommendation on Michael Morales. When I read his book, Tabernacle Prefigured, I'm thinking, I read all this stuff. How come I've never connected it before? So it was talking to you and reading his book that allowed me to begin to start making connections that will work to explain the biblical narrative. And now I'm going back to the whole gospel. And I'm reading a complete different story than what we were told. And the whole message of salvation, I'm telling you, it's life-changing, because what we thought it was, there's more to it.
Yeah, well, no question. So, as in the days of Noah, of course, we rarely look at the context of that verse, which is in Matthew 24, which is dealing with the destruction of the temple and the destruction. So at the beginning of my book, I try to show that some of the eyes we need to look at the story of Noah is through the eyes of the exile, because the Bible is not codified until after the Babylonian exile. And that's a long time from the story of Noah. So you have to figure they are going to look at the story of Noah through Babylon, the exile to Babylon, and their deliverance through those eyes. Mm-hmm. And so what is the number one feature? How did they end up in exile? Well, it's because of they have rejected the covenant of God, but he sends them into exile, takes away their kingship, their king. He takes away their identity. They move into exile. He takes away their temple. He takes away their economic, everything is gone.
Complete chaos. Yeah.
So those are the eyes we need when we're looking at Matthew 24, because this whole thing's going to repeat itself. And so when it's talking about it as in the days of Noah, I'm suggesting that we probably need to look at that more as the Babylonian exile. Like, what did that mean? I don't think that the as in the days of Noah portion in Matthew 24 is so much about the history of Noah as it is the theology of Noah, the story.
So, okay, I see what you're trying to say. So, okay, so you're not saying the story of Noah's not true. What you're saying is that the Matthew quote, he is saying to look into the chaos from the Babylonian captivity.
Yeah.
And I guess, well,
yeah, and the number one fruit of that was the destruction of the temple, which is about to happen again in, Matthew 24 is dealing with the destruction of the temple. And I suggest too in the book, which, I mean, we could argue over this. Again, it's not so much the history of Noah as it is a connection to the destruction of the temple. And talking about marrying and giving in marriage and eating and drinking and all that stuff. Like I have puzzled over that, going, why is that even in there? I mean, that doesn't make sense to me until you recognize what Noah functioned as a king priest in the sacred space, which was the ark. And so I make the suggestion that this is priestly language that we're seeing in Matthew 24, not, everyone running around getting married. It's about that, the line of the king priest going back to Noah.
You know that clearly Noah was a king because God gave him sovereignty over creation, just as he did Adam.
Right.
So that's why we have the connection with Yeshua being the
last. And then I just mentioned, because even his name, Noach, from Noach, which means rest, which takes us back to Genesis chapter 1, that at the seventh day, God rested, basically an enthronement ceremony. So we're seeing the same thing with Noah. Even his name is given because he is enthroned king, and the center of power will be, of course, on the mountain in his boat. Of course, the mountain at that time is Mount Ararat.
So you got me thinking, because that means that just as the earth was recreated in the story of Noah, and at that time, the earth was supposed to be God's sacred space, his temple.
Right.
So now the physical representation of the temple, when it's destroyed, like Shiloh was destroyed, the temple in Shiloh, for the same thing. It's a chaos, oppression, unrighteousness, corruption. So that means that the temple, as we have been saying, is a microcosm of the creation story and the order of God. We know that.
Yeah.
So now we can look at the temple from a different perspective, not only as a functioning structure which allows us to come near God, but also as a prophetic picture of what would happen if we are bringing chaos into God's temple. Is that why then? Now I understand, as I'm talking to you, now I'm understanding why it is that when we sin, we profane his temple.
Correct.
Because, so let me ask you a question. I got this question for you. I was teaching it on Wednesday, and I proposed the question to the audience, but I want to ask you. I've always wondered, how can God bring judgment on creation? If we understand that he's in covenant with Israel, he is bound by the covenant to Israel to defend them, to stand for them, to provide for them, and the exchange is obedience. We know that. But then he brings judgment upon all the earth. And I always wonder, how can that legally happen once you understand law? And then the covenant and the rainbow is actually that type of sign that proves that God has sovereignty still over his creation, and that we are breaking the covenant that he made with humanity back in the time of Noah.
Yeah, so the rainbow, I would suggest, and I didn't really go into a lot about the rainbow in the book, but it represents what we call the axis mundi. So just as a temple functioned as the axis mundi connecting heaven and earth, so did and it doesn't actually say rainbow, it's the bow in the sky. So this is the connecting point between heaven and earth. And every time when in the ancient world where the point was, where the two spheres met, there was always a temple. That was always where the god, if you will, lived, in that place that was between those two spheres. So, and then to your other point, I mean, this is just opinion, but their vocation was to be image bearers, but was to expand Eden.
Right.
So they didn't do it.
Right.
In fact, no one seems to ever do it.
By the way, by the way, if you study history like you and I have, you've always wondered, and you saw a pattern that every king that was enthroned in the ancient world, they went out to wage war. The whole
Right.
idea was to expand their kingdom. And I never understood that until the royal gardens. Now I
Yeah.
get it. It's like they were trying to expand the kingdom for their God, because that's the
Yes.
duty of the king.
Yeah, the kingdoms of this world expand through brute force, power, militarily, by killing and destroying everything in sight.
Correct.
Now we have the kingdom of heaven. How does it expand? And so Yeshua basically laid that out on the Sermon on the Mount. Everything he did was exactly how a king is supposed to expand territory,
Right.
not by killing everybody that they see. This is that death life thing coming to bear once again. He expands through, by recreating life. The nations expand by killing everybody.
Right. Do you think Israel, and after I ask this question, you answer, I'd like to ask you something about your book, but do you think Israel ever took away God's position just because they had a king leading them? Do you think Israel disregarded God? I'm talking about the structure of monarchy, okay?
Right.
Because I'm trying to make a point. They knew that the king was the image of that invisible God. They knew. Right. They knew that the king was the prince to God, but the king to Israel. We all agree with that. But I don't believe that the issue I'm having is people focus on Yeshua, king, but they use that to disregard the authority and the sovereignty over the Father. And I'm noticing that more and more and more, when even 1 Corinthians kind of tells you that even after Yeshua brings us submission on his feet, that he's going to, take the kingdom back to the Father. But when I went back to ancient Near Eastern history, Dinah, I understood that there's really not a contradiction if you consider Yeshua as a king and the Father as a great king, because they're working in conjunction with each other with the same purpose. So my concern is that people are taking, for the lack of understanding of hierarchy and monarchy and how the Bible perceives it, because Adam was not above God, but he was a king on the earth.
Right.
So sometimes I think that we need to address that, because I believe Yeshua definitely will be our king and is ruling, and he will rule, and he's our king right now.
Right.
Not literally ruling on the earth, literally, like I think, we talked about this, but in certain circles and the systems of religion, they diminish the authority of the Father and they put Yeshua above it. And to me, that's a problem.
So the ancient world, obviously, and we won't go into this, but we have the suzerain vassal relationship. Right. Yeah. But the father-son relationship replicated the suzerain vassal relationship. Obviously, it's somewhat different. Yeah. But you don't, when the king is raised up, the next in line, it doesn't eliminate the authority of the father before him. So like David and Solomon, they're probably the best example. And so obviously David had lots of sons, but the one destined for the throne was Solomon. And so Solomon went through an entire enthronement ceremony. We see that when he went down to the Gihon Spring and Nathan the prophet and all that sort of thing. But that didn't negate the authority and Solomon's submission to David.
Right. And that's really not the point that I'm trying to make, that once I understood that hierarchy, or like you say, father and son, I was able to understand better the role of Yeshua and how everything fits. It's amazing to me. And a lot of the arguments I used to have with people, or even within myself, trying to understand it, kind of went by the wayside, because, we don't have to minimize Yeshua's pre-existence, his divine nature, who he is, but understanding how it fits in the role of a hierarchy and a governmental structure. It made perfect sense.
Yeah, God would never violate that. He has an order. Again, this is order. So,
yes. Because by him giving authority to Adam and Noach, by no means diminish God's sovereignty view of our creation.
And of course, they're called the Son of God. Adam's called the Son of God.
Yeah. You would think it'd be simple, but we complicate matters. All right. So I like your book is now very extensive in chapters, which is
5 chapters.
yes,
The book is almost 50,000 words. So each chapter is approximately 10,000 words, which is a pretty long chapter.
cool. Yeah, but it's not like 12 chapters and you keep going reading and
No.
reading. Okay.
And you know me, I try to be really succinct and really focus in and just say what I need to say in as few words as I can say it.
Yeah.
And I want the books to be less than 200 pages, because once you start going, then it turns into this academic tome. And I didn't want that. I wanted a lot of people to read it.
Like this
So,
one, like Kitchen's book.
yeah.
Oh Lord. Kitchen's
Yeah.
book, amazing writer. It's got over like close to 600 pages. And it's like, I have to read it. Is like in just read a little page here, and
Yeah.
everything is deep, you know.
Yes.
Anyway, so
But you can read this book in 5 hours.
okay,
I mean, and so I do write with kind of a flow. It has a flow in it. It just keeps you moving. So the way I do that is through the verbs that I use that keeps the story moving.
okay,
And I think I have 10 pages of bibliography at the back.
beautiful. I want to ask you about the way you structure it. So
Okay.
it says, I'm looking at it on my screen here:
Okay.
foundation, architecture, history, deliverance, recreation.
Yeah.
That's quite interesting, the way you established that. I mean, I never really read a book that the chapter just says one word describing the whole chapter. Is kind of cool. Now, because I know you, we've studied for so long, and we've talked about this topic, I have an idea which direction you're going to go, but it'll be kind of nice to get an idea for the audience to understand a little bit of your mindset, not giving them all the secrets, clearly.
Right.
Give them a little bit of the mindset, why you picked these names to be the foundation for the titles of your chapters.
Okay,
Let's start with foundations.
Yeah, yes. Well, you know, if we have any hope of understanding the rest of the book, we better understand the foundations. Now, the thing I did early on is I explained what mythology was. What
Yeah.
are myths? How did that work in the ancient world? Because our first response is to go, well, that's just some fictional story about gods and primitive peoples and stuff.
Yeah.
So I tried to explain how, you know, they're the ancient stories that are passed down, but they're described in ways that are rather colorful and metaphoric, but they're explaining real events on the ground at the time, but they're just their stories, how they go through that. And then I did.
By the way, people don't realize that. They don't understand that they're trying to tell a story based on their whole worldview at that moment.
Exactly.
Once I think, Preacher's book, Preacher's book.
Yep.
Once I began to look at all the ancient texts, and my mindset was, what was their worldview? How did they perceive things? I mean, because when you read Egyptology and you go into the Exodus experience, you're thinking how ignorant. They believe that this was a god and that was a god. But then I remind myself that people still think that bunnies laid eggs doing Easter. You know what I mean? And there's some fat guy going through a chimney wearing a red suit. So we still have the same mindset, but different.
Yeah, we have cultural stories. And so, we have to understand the context of the cultural story, but we also have to understand that's the way they describe their world. And we don't describe it the same way. It doesn't mean mountains and trees and forests and grass doesn't exist. It's just they have a different way of showing it. So I explained mythology fairly briefly, and then I explained the lens of the exile and how important that's going to be as a theme running through the book. So those were the two. And then I went into the cosmic kingdom. Like, what is that? That it's not religious, it's not scientific, it's governmental. So we're looking at the whole of the cosmos operating as a kingdom. So that's pretty foundational. And then I addressed the concept of wisdom, which I have done in the other books. I didn't go into as much detail, but we have to understand if the idea of wisdom was there before the foundations of the world, what on earth does that even mean? Exactly. So the concept of wisdom, that is the main attribute that God has given to every king in order for them to be able to rule justly and righteously. So wisdom's kind of an important thing. The other area, the other foundation was what I called the cosmic mountain. And mountains in scripture are very, very important that we understand what that even means, because the cosmic mountain is the thing that comes out of the primordial waters. It's the first dry ground. It's that place that's the stable, solid place. And so what does that even mean, in the Bible and in the ancient world? So I felt that concept of cosmic mountain was important. And then I ended the chapter with the waters of creation, or excuse me, the waters of chaos, because that's how we begin. We begin the entire book, the Genesis, with the waters of chaos. And it's from those waters of chaos that God separates the waters from the waters, and dry ground appears, and we go from there. So that's kind of the basic outline for the first chapter. That's why I called it Foundations, because these are foundational concepts. And if we have any hope of understanding the story of Noah, we have to understand these foundational concepts.
By the way, when you talk about mountains, when I began to understand that a little bit more, like the ziggurats and the Genesis 40, I think 26, and it talks about Jacob. I'm sorry, 46. I can't remember right now. When the Lord appears to him in a dream.
Oh, 28.
28 angels ascending and descending, ziggurats, and then I see the Noach on the mountain, and then we have the temple, everything, like Mount Sinai. Oh, that's huge. We have this whole theme repeating itself over and over and over. And the temple on a mountain, Shiloh. Then people come around and say, well, the temple's in the city of David. You're going to go like, they missed the whole message.
Well, you consider that Eden was a mountain.
Correct.
And then we moved from Eden to Ararat, and from Ararat to Sinai. And then, we could argue, well, we'll jump ahead, to Zion. And then we have, which we call Mount Moriah, but the New Testament ends with the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is a very significant mountain. So I talk a lot about that, but everything is these mountaintop experiences, the transfiguration, receiving of the Torah. So if we don't understand what they thought about mountains, good luck. And if you've noticed in the New Testament, every time Yeshua goes up on a mountain, says he ascended the mountain in some form and he sat. And you're like, well, do we really need that extra information that he sat?
I gotta tell you, I don't think, when I began to study all these motifs, right, I'm going like, there's no possible way that these people are like just making up New Testament stories.
Right.
Because it's lining up so perfectly with the whole Torah and the prophets' motifs of recreation. It's just too much of a coinky-dinky, like I always say.
So most of the mountains where Yeshua goes up on a mountain and sits are not named. And then, of course, what I tell people is we always argue over the names, but that's irrelevant. So the mountain, of course, the top of the mountain is going to represent the government of that, whoever that is. And in this case, the kingdom of God. And it says he sat. So we're getting these glimpses of his enthronement throughout the New Testament. He goes up on a mountain and sits. It's over and over.
I got to stop you there, because I always wondered how you always kept telling me about the enthronement of Messiah. And I can see, I'm starting to see the motif in there within the story that when you mentioned it. So that is true, because sitting, no one can sit on the Temple Mount,
right? Unless they're descended from David.
Unless they're a descendant of David, exactly.
So sitting on mountains is a big deal. We just kind of go, oh, that's nice. He's sitting with all these people.
That's true.
And all the language of the ziggurat and explaining that I have in chapter 2. Because now we're starting to get specific and personal with all of the different mountains.
So architecture.
Architecture is related to, now we're building temples on top of mountains, and anciently what that looked like and what that looked like in Israel's economy. So if we're going to talk about temples on top of mountains, now we have to talk about kings in temples on top of mountains. So I've got a whole section that covers that, and and then I talk about Daniel, because his whole story, remember the 5, and then he takes, I just went blank, from the mountain, remember the final kingdom as the part of the mountain. So all that kind of stuff. And then I take the ziggurat concept down to the altar, because the altar is made in the pattern of a mountain. Right. So now, what does all that mean, et cetera. So this is
So now when we read, I'm sorry to interrupt you, it just came to mind. So now when we
Okay.
read Thessalonians, and Paul is talking about the son of perdition sitting in the temple as if it's God, then
Right.
people would understand that if Paul is telling us some guy is going to come in and he's going to usurp the authority given to the line of David and to basically enthrone himself in the house of God, which is a huge no-no.
Exactly.
Other things start making more sense.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, the goal here is to help the Bible make sense. Is what I tell everybody wherever I go.
Yeah.
Let's face it, there's a lot in the Bible that doesn't make any sense. So now our job here is to try to help that for you make sense. So chapter 3 is history. So now I really, what I did was I took Noah out of Canaan, the promised land, that whole area, and I took him with his father Lamech, to the region of Ararat, which anciently was called Urartu, or sometimes Arata. And at a certain period in history, there was a lake there called Lake Von, which it was a very mild climate, but it turns out that region was the #1 grape growing region on planet Earth for a long time.
Wow.
This is where most of the wines and the vineyards came out of that area. So I just kind of backtracked. This is where I do my fictional story, and I backtracked and pulled him out so that he was planting vineyards before the flood in that region, and that he took the vine from the vineyard that was passed from Adam to Seth, and Seth dug it up, and he took that vine and he planted it in the region of Ararat around this lake called Lake Von. So I develop a whole story with Noah growing, and I describe the vineyards and the treading of the grapes and stuff like that. In the meantime, earlier on, I have Cain. He moved from the region and he went to southern Mesopotamia, and he became the ruler over Uruk, Uruk, which is where the city that Inanna ruled over with the Great White Temple. So we have these two things that are kind of growing up beside each other. And then at the end of chapter 3, I have them meet. So I think it's in that chapter. I also have the sons of God and the daughters of men. So I'm kind of, it's a very historical chapter. One of the other things I talk about too, because I relate the daughters of men to the harem, which is a political entity in the king's court. And so we see, Solomon with his 1,000, but that was a very political thing that he was doing by having all these women in his harem. Right. I mean, he was making political alliances all over the planet.
Yeah, people don't know that. They assume he was just some lustful guy, but when you study ancient Near East, you realize that they needed to have blood covenants between kingdoms, so that having a grandchild, a grandkid with that king and that king would make you think twice before you fight against each other.
Right.
It's logical, really, if you think about it.
Well, and you think the daughters of men weren't necessarily of a royal line. They were just all stuffed into the harem. But the harem ended up having a lot of political power. So you think of Bathsheba. She would have been part of the harem, if you will, but she was the mother of a king and the wife of another king.
That's definitely an interesting twist to that story.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of cool about this type of books, that you're able to inject in there some of your worldview or what you perceived based on some of their meaning to share with people a broader perspective. Maybe they never really thought about it before.
Right. And I went out of my way citing sources. Now, they're obviously, when I'm writing my fictional stories, I have creative license, and I can insert in there kind of how I see it. Obviously, we don't know whether that's true or not, but it helps move the story along. So if you think about the political alliances and the wives in is very important when we see the story of Solomon cutting up, threatening to cut the child in half. Right. And so remember that the two women, I suggest that is a parable of the house of Israel, and that the two women represent the house of Israel and the house of Judah, and each vying that their son would be the ruler over the kingdom.
I think that will be a perfect explanation prophetically what would happen in the future. It's kind of cool.
Yeah. So obviously these women are going to bat for their kid. That's my kid, and my kid's going to be the heir to the throne, not yours.
Well, what's interesting is, like, Solomon and Adonijah went through that. And then later on, you see when Solomon died, Rehoboam, one of his sons, and Jeroboam, who was not a son, but he was a representative of Ephraim. They were having that type of, that's kind of interesting right there.
Yeah. Yeah. So I try to take those stories and see it, from a more, I hate to use the word political, but you understand the backdrop, because you can't read these kings without understanding that they're going to war all the time. Their goal is to bring peace to the empire and make life better for their subjects. But this is just a constant, they're constantly fighting other empires.
That when I was doing a scholarly course about it was a free one. Somebody sent me from I forgot the college now, but it's a very well-known college. And they were talking about, Israel and ancient Near East. And I never really thought about the Bible as a political book, but they made mention of the reason why Assyria didn't destroy Israel when they first got there in the beginning. And I always wondered, they took them captives. One of the few kingdoms that would disperse its people. That was part of the whole thing, which is kind of interesting, considering the whole master plan of God. Okay.
Right.
But it's fascinating because they did not destroy Israel because its regional location and its high level of olive oil that they produce, they didn't have the same type in Assyria.
Yes.
So all a political thing, and I never thought about it.
Yeah,
that really opened my understanding to, whoa, wait a minute. So all these interactions between covenants and all this stuff here and there, it was all basically a government in peril.
Exactly.
Like today.
So that's really key. I mean, I figured, if Noah, and this is in chapter 4, if Noah is trading with the southern Mesopotamian region, he could be trading wine, because wine in Mesopotamia was for the kings. The people didn't drink wine. They didn't have access to wine. It was only for the court. Yeah. And so wine, vineyards were a big deal because of who had access to it and the prestige it represented for the king.
Well, that shows us the story of that. Who was it? The husband of Jezebel.
Naboth?
The husband of Jezebel. Ahab.
Yeah, Ahab and then Naboth.
That's right. He basically took the vineyard.
Right. Well, you couldn't just, you had to have some clout, royalty here. You're going to take a vineyard, so we don't recognize the significance of things like that. So I try to add stuff like that to help people think past the, chapter.
But wait a minute. But that's really cool. I didn't think about, I understood about the location. You talked about the vineyards. So by default, when you go back to the history and you find out where was the most renowned location from the ancient way and ancient, about wines and vineyards, it's kind of hard to make an argument about not being the place where he would have been.
Right. Yeah. Well, so there's some intrigue in the book for him when the boat lands on Ararat and they get off the boat, and then he builds an altar, and then he builds a vineyard. Yeah. And then the flood. So, that's all kind of hidden away in there.
For you to learn, for you to go and get the book. And let me make a quick plug for you. Okay. So this book right now, you can find it on Amazon, correct?
Yes. So right now, paperback and audio.
Okay.
So, yes. We did have, as we're recording this, we had some issues with the Kindle, the ebook.
Okay.
So it should be back up in a few days. So probably, I'm going to say by the 10th of October, the ebook should be back online.
Well, sounds good. You have perfectly outlined behind you there to your left.
Yes.
Right there. Look at that. Perfect.
All my books.
Yeah, please.
And I should mention the Spanish version. Yes. Thank you to Lisa Velasquez, has already been translated. And we're working on the formatting right now. And my David Farley does my formatting. So he has a life and a business. So we're trying to get, so I'm hoping the Spanish version will be out pretty soon.
Let me know, because I will definitely promote it for you.
Yeah.
All right, tell us about chapter 4 and then chapter 5. We got about 10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. So I talked a little bit about Noah, and I actually described the flood, and I kind of connect part of it to the gods and Yahweh, but that's part of the fictional story. But the two sections in chapter 4 that are my favorite I did something called the reed boat, because the ancient world, they were all reed boats, and it's more than likely that Noah's Ark would have been a reed boat. That was logical, made of bitumen, pitch, wood, and that sort of thing, and kind of tied it a little bit in there to the, Yom Kippur. The idea of the smearing of the blood is the same motion we have for the smearing of the bitumen on the boat to preserve and protect it, but to cover it. Kafar, there's a bunch of stuff in there. And I go into a lot of detail about the reeds and comparing it so Moses is not in a basket, okay? Moses is in a reed boat.
Right.
The reed boats in the ancient world, they initially would build a sanctuary for their gods out of reeds. And then when they were finished with that, they would tear it down and they would turn it into a boat. So these reed boats in the ancient world were the place of the gods. So you can imagine now, jumping ahead. So Pharaoh, the god in Egypt at the time was Horus, and Horus's story is very similar to Moses' story, being hid in a boat and, found by a family member and protected. It's very interesting. So I kind of describe, okay, when Pharaoh's daughter, and let me just mention that Pharaoh was the representation of the god Horus, which is kind of interesting in ancient Egypt.
Can I share the screen and show some reed boats that I found, reed boats from Mesopotamia, so the audience can get an idea?
Yeah.
Can you see it there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, would it be a little bit more like the ones on the right here? Oh, this one right here.
I have to put my glasses on. Now we do have the round boat, and that's a whole thing in ancient Mesopotamia. So this one, see right there, that round boat, but how it has a hut.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
That's the sanctuary. So that's where the god would be. That the god would be represented in that space. So any of the other ones that you see that have like a hut on top of the boat, that's very significant.
Look at that one. That's really cool right here.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is a better visual of Moses. He wouldn't have just been in his little basket on the Nile. He would be inside this space, which was designated as a sacred space for the god in this reed boat. So now imagine
it would actually explain why the daughter of Pharaoh was willing to take him and adopt him, knowing that Pharaoh said to kill them.
Because he's a god. So she's there, and then she sees in this reed boat this person that she's expecting Horus, because this story is the story of Horus, only it ain't Horus. It's not her father's god. It's Moses, who is God's, image bearer on earth. So this is has everything to do with royalty. No wonder she took him back to the palace, because he would have been a god to her.
That's pretty interesting. I mean, I didn't really never consider that. Look at this one right here. This is
there were. So again, they would build a sanctuary out of the reeds and the pitch and the wood, and then they would tear it down and erect it. And then they would sail these boats down the Nile River from temple to temple, because they represented the gods in their temples.
Now I understand what you always kept telling me about Noach as a temple.
Yeah.
The ark as a temple. Yes.
Yeah.
I did not know that until now.
Okay,
I studied the reed and stuff, but not that, what you said.
Yeah, my premise is because the largest boat on the Euphrates at the time was probably about 10 feet. And so I tell everyone, basically Moses built an aircraft carrier sitting on the Euphrates. Like, how does that work?
Right.
So this is this imagery of the macro of the micro, This is a sanctuary that represents all of the cosmos, that God is restoring the cosmos as an ark building, and of course it ends up on top of the mountain. The last section, another section in chapter 4, we'll go through this quickly. I compare the ark of Noah with the tabernacle and in the wilderness, and this concept of both were the portable place of the presence of God, which I connect somewhat to Ezekiel chapter 1, the wheel within the wheel. the idea of the portable throne of God.
Yeah,
So
but if you didn't make the connection between the reed boats
right,
and what it meant, people, I would have never really connected it.
right.
So that's
Well,
cool.
and you think, isn't it interesting? Oh, so in Egypt, they had a place called Aru, which it was a reeds, like an island of reeds, and that was considered their paradise.
It's
Their
interesting. Oh man, so it says the Sea of Reeds.
yes,
Not the Red Sea, it's actually the Sea of
correct.
Reeds. Now it makes sense. Got it.
That's the island of reeds in the sea is the afterlife of the Egyptians. So
So
where does Pharaoh end up in? The Sea of Reeds.
so wait a minute. So that actually helps us really bring it home to a new creation motif, that God is the one who gives resurrection and no one else.
Exactly. Yeah. There's your end in the Reed Islands.
Yeah,
You
but you
know?
see, but that's exactly what I'm trying to tell the audience in the beginning of our interview. I was telling you that we are looking at the Bible from the outside in instead from the inside out.
Yeah.
And when like today, I learned about the reed boats being as temples. I did not know that, and I've been studying ancient Near East for the last 11 years.
Well, I can't say I knew it. So just like, with my 9 pages of bibliography, I have learned a great deal and tried to synthesize it down in a way that I summarize and I give you all of the citations. You can look it up for yourself.
That's cool.
So chapter 5 is basically pulling it all together. And now I go into the vineyard as new creation. So the vineyard is the new creation, the new garden. And we start all over again, right? And now we have a vine in the vineyard.
Wait. So the whole miracle in Cana of the wine,
Yes.
that is new creation.
Yes.
And the vine, what do you call it? The vessels, what do you call it? The wine,
Yeah, the wine and the water and the clay pots.
Yeah, no, not only that, but the other one, the wine, what do you call it? The oh man, I forgot.
You'll think of it.
It's
You'll
talking
think of
about,
it in a minute.
yeah, it's talking
So
about
the idea of the vine in the vineyard, the vine in the ancient world represented the king. Okay, the trunk of the vine. And of course, this one's producing grapes. Now we understand John 15, 16, 17, when Yeshua says he's the vine, that's a hallmark back to Solomon, because King Solomon represented the vine, David represented the olive tree, and King Saul represented the fig tree. So we have, that whole thing. So the vineyard is the all new creation motif all over through and through. So I go through the graphic language of the vineyard, treading the grapes and the wrath of God and the cup and, all that kind of stuff in there.
Skin, I got it. Wine skin that you're talking about, the wine skin.
Yep.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So you could not put so as soon as the harvest came, the grapes literally started fermenting almost on their cluster. And so they had to get them to the treading floor as quickly as they could. So you could not put fermented wine into a new wineskin. That was called new wine. Right. You could actually put wine that wasn't fermenting. You could put into an old wineskin, but you couldn't put new wine that was fermenting into an old wineskin. So again, we have new creation language. So then we go through that, and then this is where I talk about chaos in the ancient world, and then I move it to cultural chaos for today. And I just go to town on everything that's going on, from scientism to transhumanism to transgenderism in cultural chaos.
Right. That's exactly what's happening right now.
Exactly. And so it's all in there. And then I close out the book with the new creation story, essentially. And that is going to be the resurrection of Yeshua the Messiah, the ultimate in new creation, recreation, however you want to do it.
That's awesome. I enjoyed going through how you
now you have to read it.
Yeah, right. No, right. but I do actually, when you read the introduction of a book, sometimes you get a sense, but some of the introductions of certain books, they're a little bit like tedious. and they don't really get to the point, so you don't really see the whole intent. Being that I already understand the topic, because we've discussed this at length for years, but even today I've been able to connect different dots that I never did before. And I want to thank you for writing the book. I want to thank you for your research. I want to thank you for your friendship. And one of the things people don't know is that everything you just said, I taught it to you.
I know. What can I say? I am so humbled to be in your presence. I hardly know what to say.
For the audience, please know that's a running joke.
Yes, it's a running joke.
Yeah, a Revive. We have the whole conference, it's 1,000 people. And I needed to make sure I told the audience that it was Dinah who taught me everything I knew. So I like to get her back. Anyway, Dinah, I love you. Thank you so much for joining us. I pray that your book just hits a huge, and we need to get your books into logos.
Amen.
A great resource for them. And if you want to know more about Dinah Dye's books, please go to Amazon or go to your website, right? Tell us your website and where they can reach you.
Yeah, foundationsandtorah.com. The books will give you the link right to Amazon, and they're on Amazon right now in Audible and paperback with Kindle coming soon.
That sounds great. Thank you guys for joining us today. It's a pleasure and an honor always having the opportunity to share with you the beautiful things we're learning about the Bible. Remember, like John Walton always says, the Bible was written for us, but it was not written to us. So it's time for us to learn to read the Bible from the inside out. And that's exactly what Dinah is doing with her book. So thank you, Dinah, my friend. Love you very much, and much success to you. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Shalom.
Thank you, my friend.
Bye-bye.